Okay, welcome guys. My name is Ben King. I'm presenting to you today on careers and high performance. Just wanted to say thanks to Kim for the opportunity to present for Deakin students. My outcomes for today, what I'd like to get across to you guys is outlining careers in high performance sport and what that looks like. Give you practical advice for when you start to navigate that, and then delve down into my discipline of strength and conditioning and what are the principles behind that. You're probably sitting there and thinking, why should I listen to you? So a little bit about myself is my name is Ben King. I'm a strength conditioning coach at the Victorian Institute of Sport. I've worked here for about 5 years now. This is my first Olympic cycle, so leading into Tokyo, where I'll have a number of athletes go to the games. My journey, so I started uni in 2012. I went to Deakin myself. I did a double degree in exercise science and business sports management. My first placement, very stupidly, was at the end of my uni degree, so I didn't do any placements throughout, and I did it at a PT at a gym, YMCA. I did my first internship at a strength conditioning company in the same year, and then later that year started at the VIS in an internship. After that, in the end of my internship, I managed to hang around and kind of hold on to a part-time job. And in between 2017 and 2019 is what I call the vortex. Is basically I went down the rabbit hole of saying yes to every opportunity that came my way, every athlete that expressed an interest in some sort of program, and I just strung myself thin across a number of different sports. So I was working in jiu-jitsu, in MMA, in wrestling, in golf, in gymnastics, in basketball, and a number of gen population clients as well in PT. So yeah, pretty strung thin to that time, but came out at the other end and managed to hold on to a full-time job at the VIS, which I've been there since. So working in sport, what does that look like, and what is it going to mean for you guys as you progress through your careers and move on into the real world? Is what I want you to think of as a sports industry as a whole, and not just, we all see the elite sports, and that's the orange triangle there at the top. But as I've just gone through, it took me a really long time to get to elite sports, to get to the top. And associated with that comes along with sponsorships and government funding and spectators and all those sorts of things that come at the very top, and that's where all the eyeballs are. But sport exists on an entire spectrum, and the goal of a number of organizations and a goal of a number of high performing athletes is to facilitate mass participation and inspire the next generation of sport within the country. A lot of sports have high cultural heritage in certain countries. So in Australia, sports like swimming and rowing, outside of the big sports like cricket and footy, will be held very highly regarded by the government, and they'll be highly funded, as they have cultural importance to us as a country and us as a nation. Other countries have their own sports. If you look at like Iran or America, they're very invested into wrestling, and you can kind of pick and choose every games. You can see where the countries invest their money and invest their time. There's considerations all up and down that spectrum in terms of equipment and travel and taxation of government. So think about the sports spectrum. You guys can have opportunities to work all across this spectrum, and it's not just necessarily elite sport. Obviously, ideally, I'd love us like to live and work up there, but as I'll go through today, there's a number of things that come along with that. So the flow of information and of funding, the way that it works here in Australia is the government. So the governing party, being either usually Labor or Liberal, will then have a sports and recreation minister at federal and then at state level. The way it works here is they'll interact with the AS and Sport Australia, then with the board of the NSO, so national sporting bodies. So the CEOs then will have their certain objectives, whether they're an organisation that's more participation based or more high performance based. The high performance team will then take directions from that and will present and gain funding. The high performance manager or director will then give out funding and hire and fire staff for coaching staff, and then the support services, which is where I come in. And that's what I'm part of the multidisciplinary team, the coaching staff being head coaches and assistants, and the support staff including a number of tertiary support services, including strength and conditioning, medicine and doctor, physiotherapist, massage, nutrition, and something in an area that's really growing is performance lifestyle and athlete wellbeing engagement. And we have a number of athlete and wellbeing engagement officers at the VIS. The way that we tend to think about this is the athlete's kind of in the center, and all of these things sit in their orbit. Is there's, on the left-hand side, more of the, outside things in their life, so sponsors and press and some of the things that are close to them, like agents and family, and kind of on the right-hand side is all these different support services that plug into them at some stage. And I want to get this idea kind of out of your head, is having this around the athlete and all just plugging in at different times can lead to some massive issues of communication and interventions kind of clashing into each other. So what I'd really like to see is a really good flow of information and everyone on the same page, and still the athlete sitting in the center of all of our interventions, but it not being that, the physio's hitting one end and the strength and conditioning are hitting here and the coach. We'd all like to be on the same team. And from the athlete's point of view, it's just training and it's just sports preparation. So ideally, we have a base of shared values and expectations that's driven by us all and driven and held accountable by us. And that's under constant review. We're always looking to improve that. We're always looking to build on that. Then in the middle there, around the athletes and the players, that's where expertise comes in, and we're giving context-specific expertise, and we're building and maintaining those relationships and making sure we're fulfilling the needs of the athletes relative to the sport. Then from an organization point of view, there's iterative planning, reviewing and doing, and taking time and space away from that to collect the data and see what worked and what didn't and how can we review. And hopefully this process is an ever-evolving process, and it feeds in back through the bottom and through this pyramid. This isn't a VIS document as such, but I think it really represents what ideally is working in a high performance team. The different sports and how they present this team will be very different. So if it's a track and field setting, like on the left there, or a wrestler or an individual sport, given the sport itself and the funding available and how many coaches can be involved in that, all of those roles that I went through before might just be one person. On the right, obviously we have North Melbourne, footy club, well funded by the AFL. They'll have a large support staff, a number of technical coaches, a number of support services, strength and conditioning, sports science. So how this presents and how this model works across a range of sports is highly individual and highly dependent. There's pros and cons for both. Obviously on the left-hand side, it being one person, you can really develop a relationship with the coach. You can be really integrated and iterative in that approach. But there's also issues with bias and getting one message constantly. On the right, you have a big team. You've got lots of ideas, lots of collaboration. But with that, then comes a challenge of good communication, good processes, roles and responsibilities. So neither approach, I think, is better or worse. The sports themselves will present what's right for each side and how that works. But that's how the athlete will interact with that staff and how they'll, continue to hone their craft and hopefully go on to win more medals. Some of the benefits of working in sport, and this is for me personally, is it's really fast paced. There's always something coming up. There's always an event. And that was what was a little bit jarring about COVID last year, is there was nothing to look forward to. There was nothing on the horizon. So my whole job is sitting down and saying, okay, where's the next event? What have we got coming up? And how do we prepare for it, basically? And we want to get the best result possible. And that's always ever changing, and it's fast paced and it's really exciting. And COVID put a massive halt to that. So we're now getting back into that, and it's really, really fun, and you're always working on some sort of timeline. The teamwork element for me is a really big part of it, and being able to work with other support services, with coaches, with athletes, and having that collaborative approach is just really fun for me, and I really enjoy that. And the very nature of high performance sport is always trying to push our boundaries. We're always trying to find what's better, what's best. How do we beat our competition? And when you've got multiple people all pushing in the same direction and trying to achieve the best possible outcome, you get this real sense of progression and real sense of growth all the time. And it's really motivating. It's really exciting. It's not all flowers and roses though. Some of the drawbacks of working in sport is it's very insecure. Funding cycles might only be, for an Olympic sport, might only be every 4 years, and even less than a professional sport, it might only be on a yearly basis. So, if you move your family out to work for a sporting club in another state or another country, there is an element of risk involved there, because there's no guarantee that the coach might not be fired or you might not be moved on for no fault of your own, essentially. It's transient. Is some things, in the same way as it's fast paced and it's dynamic, is sometimes things don't last. Is you might be in a really good place on the right time, and then things change, funding cycles change, the cultural heritage of the sport moves on, the athlete pool just isn't quite there, the coach that you're working with leaves. So things can be very transient. and therefore not as consistent as perhaps some other industries. If you take construction or accountancy or something where there's going to be a steady flow of work for the next X amount of years, and it's a very set in stone industry, is strength and conditioning in sport is still not fully integrated and not ingrained, and so is a number of support services. So things can be transient. And on the right, depending on the scenario that you're in, sometimes there's a lack of control. The coaching by nature is nurturing, but it's also instructive, and coaches that are there to lead their programs and to put out their interventions, and they're responsible and they're tasked with performance of the athletes. In that way, sometimes the athletes can yank back control and not be receptive, or coaches might take that control away from support services, and you may struggle to have an impact there. So some considerations around some of the drawbacks of working in sport. For me personally, I would still do it for free if I could. The benefits and the thrill and the drive and the progression feeling is worth all the risks involved. But that's just me. That doesn't mean that it's right. I want to be really honest with this talk today, guys, and I want to make sure that you're getting the full picture of what it's like working in sport. And I don't want to hear to make it, seem all rainbows and how fun is it working with athletes. There definitely is some hard times. It's definitely insecure. But in saying that, I still love it and I still do it free. So strength and conditioning, what is it? Very simply, it's a physical performance coach who uses exercises to make them better. Even simpler is we're there to increase physical performance and decrease injuries. I like to think of it is that we're tasked with the performance. So by increasing physical performance, we're increasing a result. So really, we're no different than any other coach. We're just tasked with winning. Because we want to win, we want to set new records, we want to beat our competition. We're there for no other reason than to win. We just happen to be experts in the field of strength and conditioning and physical performance, and that's where we can have our impact. The populations that we can work with, individuals, teams, both professional and amateur. So being like professional athletes on a world stage, or amateur athletes building up and developing through national and international standards and moving on to professional ranks. Academy-based athletes, so underage athletes moving through like professional academies. And that can look very different depending on the sport. You see some soccer academies around the world, big clubs, they're almost full-time athletes. They're fully ingrained in the club compared to some other sports like even in footy, they're starting to, in Melbourne, they're starting to bring about some academies. In other sports, it might be, development squads or high performance squads that are coming through the pathway. There's a lot of schools now that are taking up strength conditioning as part of their curriculum, as part of their school-based teams. So working in private schools in Melbourne is becoming much more of a fledged career, and it's really ingrained and really big in the USA. Is working in schools, high schools, colleges is definitely ingrained into their education pathway and into their curriculum. And another one that's leaning on in the American space, but certainly growing in Australia, is the private industry and working in strength and conditioning. So using those same principles, but having your own facility, people come and pay you for your services, and that might be amateur athletes playing their own sports. It might be pros that are out of a job. It might be pros that don't get the support that they're after. It might just be general population, people that want to train like an athlete and they want to get more athletic. So they come and see you to do strength and conditioning training. What these jobs look like. So this is a job that's currently up at the moment. So this is a high performance in New Zealand. So basically the AIS, but for New Zealand, they're based out of Dunedin. And what are the qualifications necessary? So at least an undergrad, you need a certification. So for us, that's the Australian Strength and Conditioning Association. You need a postgrad is desirable. So you're doing a master's. First aid CPR, entry level specialist certification. So again, like an ACA. A recognised postgrad in sports science, again, desirable but not necessary, and some sort of certification in lifting competencies. You'll see a number of jobs that will say like powerlifting or Olympic lifting, and that just means you're competent around barbells, using exercise prescription, and you understand the principles, and that's something we'll go to later in the presentation. So that's what it looks like for me. I did my undergrad at Deakin, I did my postgrad at Edith Cowan. Then did my ACA level 1 and 2. Outside of that, you also apply for the professional scheme. So then you're accredited as a level 2 professional coach. And that's what's required as a minimum standard in Australia to work at high performance level, both across the network, as in AIS network and the VIS and every associated state body, but also in professional sports, so working in the AFL or NBL or A-League or wherever. That's the minimum standard that's expected. The certifications that are necessary, first aid and CPR, and also most of the time is working with children's check. On top of that, you're looking at 3 to 5 years of unpaid work. You're looking at financial insecurity, long hours, early mornings, and job insecurity. And I don't want to scare anyone off, and I don't want to make this seem like it's all doom and gloom. But that's the reality, and that's what I faced. That's what every young S&C will face coming up. And it's not limited to strength and conditioning only. That this will be across management. This will be across sports science. This will be across physiology, physiotherapy. There's these themes, while the qualification on the left will obviously differ relevant to the bodies that are adjudicating over those areas, is the notes on the right are fairly constant throughout, and they seem to be key themes that you see as you're trying to fledge your way into high performance sport. It's a highly competitive industry. A lot of people want to do it, so therefore there tends to be a bit of a race to the bottom. Who can work longer? Who can work for cheaper? Who can hang around the most? Who can put in the most work to be the one that gets there with a golden goose? And I'm certainly guilty of that. Is I worked very, very hard, almost too hard, and I managed to come out the other end of it with a job that I love. But it's not the easiest pathway. That's not to say that there's plenty of other industries that have their own associated difficulties, but this is just reflective of the strength and conditioning field. The typical pathway, so where does the strength and conditioning coach come from and where do they go? Is you'll start as an intern, obviously, and you kind of work your way into a part-time role as an assistant. So that's either assisting with a bigger program, a bigger squad, or maybe you've got a smaller squad as your own, but it's still not quite a full-time role. You'll then progress into a lead role. So you'll lead the sport that you work with, as in with that team. You'll work with a coach, or you'll work with an institute, or you'll work within an academy-based system, and you'll lead that program. You're kind of the head of that sport. You might not run the whole department, but you're head of that sport. From there, there's opportunities then to become national leads. Certainly something that the UK do really well, but something that we have here in Australia is that we'll work as a lead across the whole sport. So if there's a question that comes up in netball, who's the lead for netball? Who works with the national team? Who do we go and speak to if we have any questions about working in netball? And same in swimming, and same in a number of different sports. From there, you're probably looking at progressing into a strength and conditioning department manager. So overseeing in an institute, you'd be overseeing a number of different sports. Perhaps in a professional team, you're overseeing the entire physical prep. So that might include all the way down to academy. It might be multiple coaches. It might be integrating sports science in. So you have a wide scope for managing the department. From there, usually the progression for a strength and conditioning coach is to move into high performance management. It's not limited to that. Many people will end up as a department manager or as an S&C lead and stay there and be really comfortable there. But the trend that I'm noticing, and certainly it's reflective of, particularly in professional sports, is the high performance managers that we see definitely have a strength and conditioning background, or tend to. And because of the training prescription and the really in-depth planning that they have to do with coaches and administrators, it tends to suit that skill set quite well. In that role, you're overseeing you're overseeing the entire physical preparation program. So that'll include integrating physios and doctors and S&C sports science, and fully integrating that within the sports preparation program. So technical, tactical work that the sports coach is doing. So making sure those two things are seamless, and quite often they're referred to as the right-hand man or right-hand woman to the coach, and making sure they're fully integrated, and all the planning's on the same page. They're updating about injuries, about protocols, return to play, managing things when they come up, like concussion. There's lots of considerations to have, but you're running this whole management department and pulling all the pieces together. From there, where do you go? A lot of people will go into sports coaching if they've been in a sport for a long time. They may look to leave the industry and work somewhere else, or there's certainly a pathway there into administration and into managing. Say in a footy club, you might become the football manager, or at the VIS, you might become a performance manager over a number of different sports. Or there's many pathways from there, but this is kind of the typical pathway. So this is some research by a colleague of mine, Alex Occasion, who's a researcher now out of ACU, but this was done at the time when he worked in the AFL, and he did a really interesting study that he looked across a number of different high performance practitioners and saw what were the accreditations and the experience necessary. And I thought it was really relevant to show you guys as you're starting to leave. You may not be interested in strength and conditioning itself, but certainly if you are, this is what's there, and it gives you a good idea of that. What's required in sport? What do you need to have under your belt when you're working in the sport industry? So from a strength and conditioning perspective, the ACA, as I mentioned before, is the highest strength there, but certainly some other national bodies like the NSCA, which is the American version of the ACA, and then some other relevant certifications like the FMS, which is a movement screening or a sports science degree. The third most voted for there is that qualifications don't really impact employability. So they're looking at other things like experience, they're looking at networking, they're looking at impact and results as a key critical component on how they're hiring and how they're putting together staff. The minimum qualifications for a part-time or an assistant SNC, kind of that, a second rung up from an intern. So you're definitely going to have an undergrad degree. 62% is not, a very high majority. There's certainly, scope for you not to have that and work into that role. But as a minimum standard across there and as an expectation across from what I've seen, an undergraduate degree is certainly necessary. From there, a postgrad is becoming more common at that level. It's just, like I said before, a bit of a race to the bottom. The person, if you've got 60 applicants on a job, and 40 of them have masters, you're going to take out the 20 that don't and then go down from there. So it's becoming more of a competitive advantage, I must say. Good to see that the experience is there as a key critical component, and that'll get into as we move through this. Now this is the senior SNC coach. The expectation now for a postgrad is much higher. So having a postgrad degree in that is certainly much more of an expectation for a senior SNC coach. But again, the decision making isn't necessarily only around qualifications. Experience and results that you prove that you can do is certainly a key consideration, even up to a senior level. High performance manager, so undergrad, postgrad, and now is even higher. A high consideration is experience. So what does experience look like? Like how long and how often do you need? So highly experienced in elite sport with people management skills. So showing that you've had some management before and you've worked in elite sport. Quite often the barrier for people coming out of junior sport is having work in elite sport. So finding a way to facilitate coaching across and coaching anyone, but having elite sport experience seems to be necessary. 4 to 7 years seems to be the most commonly identified bracket as necessary experience to move on to high performance management. And 8+ being fairly desirable. And then remuneration. So this is across a number of different sports. So NBL, AFL, and the likely remuneration seems to be 150 to 200 grand. Most, nearly a third of respondents said that this is reflective of professional sport and at a high performance manager level. So usually, 5 to 8 years of experience plus, postgraduate degree. So based on all that, what should we do? What steps should you take? Is first thing you're doing now is get qualified and make sure that's not a barrier for entry for you. Is that they're identifying your resume. If you don't have those and you don't have a really good, strong recommendation, is that'll just get wiped. Is if you don't have the undergrad, you don't have the postgrad, and you're going for a certain degree where everyone else has those things, that'll just get wiped. Second thing, get experience. And what I should have written there and what is probably the most important thing for you guys is networking and making sure you know someone and that they know you and trust you and like you, and they'll bring you into that role. But experience will be the best way for you to learn and fill those gaps. So I can't emphasize enough how much getting experience is your biggest competitive advantage over anyone you're applying against. Is the experience and knowing how to apply your craft. And that's not even just from a strength and conditioning perspective. That's from any perspective. That's from a management, that's from a sports management, a marketing, anything. Your experience will be the most important thing, and you will learn how to apply your craft in a real world setting. And then secondly, you'll develop the relationships and start to show that you're worthwhile, you're making results, you're showing that you can really have an impact on these athletes' careers, and you'll start to then get more opportunities as you go along. As I mentioned before, the nature of high performance sport is that you're constantly progressing and you'll always have something to learn. So I can't stress to you enough how much learning all the time is really important, and there'll always be a lesson there for you to take. And one of the key lessons that I wish I had heard early in my career or earlier in my career is giving value. Is I had a mindset in there that I was going to take, or I was there to learn essentially. And in a way that can be a selfish mindset is I'm not there just to take knowledge for myself and go apply it elsewhere. It's no, this is my setting now. How can I provide value for you as an athlete, as a coach, as an administrator, as a leads, as a whatever you are? How can I make your life easier? How can I make your job better? How can I impact you? Rather than taking value as in thinking, what can I learn? What is the process for this? What are the protocols for that? Is having a giving mindset. And if you're giving, and it's a good way to think about having everyone in the green. If you've done a favor for everyone, there's a number of favors there that they're more inclined to give to you. Humans are reciprocal beings and we're socially inclined. If you're giving out value and you're providing support for other people, the support will come back to you. And if it doesn't, then you can hold your head really high and you know you've made a number of people's lives better. So one thing I heard when I was at uni all the time was, oh, there's so much money in sport now. It's so clever that you're going into that. That's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. It's just so, I was almost heralded as this prophet, and I just figured out that, oh, there's so much money in sport. That'll be great for you. And so I only thought about the other day. I remember hearing that so viscerally, and it was encouraging for me. But the reality was harsh. So one of the biggest growth periods early in the 2010. So, with the growth average at 4.3%, the global markets now, it's basically over $500 billion. Nike being the biggest sports company. I know they're obviously working in apparel, but they're listed as the 13th highest company on Forbes, and ESPN listed as the 58th. The Forbes top 13 list. So the industries there on the right, you can see that technology and leisure, things like luxury and leisure tend to dominate the global market. And Nike comes in at the bottom as the highest sports-based company, although they are, in fashion and apparel. The top 10 biggest industries in the world, so globally. So life insurance, life and health insurance, global pensions, commercial real estate. You can read through these, but you can see the number there on the right is a little bit higher than 500 billion. So 4,384 billion, I believe, is a lot higher than 500. So you can see the industries where we stack up against other markets is not as big. Australia, we're looking at finance being our biggest industry, professional health services, health, consumer goods, some mining and banking, as well as supermarkets and groceries. So our biggest market's 195 billion, down to the 10th highest being 67 billion. If we look at where sport compares to that, the total income or the total, the market size, we're looking at 19 billion. So relative, it's certainly a big industry, and it's not a small industry to work in. But if we go back to that, so there's so much money in sport now, it's a little bit of a red herring. That shouldn't be your only consideration in terms of looking at these jobs. That's not the only reason you do any job. If you wanted to just make money only, there's certainly many jobs that you could go and do. But I want you to go in with your eyes fully open and not be fooled as I was, because I went in, expecting all this money, all these jobs, all these opportunities, but the reality is not so. And if we look at the highest paid strength and conditioning coaches that are out there, so this is it's largely dominated by college coaches. You're looking at really big colleges, lots of funding, and pay packets in the hundreds of thousands. The average wage for a strength and conditioning coach in Australia, so you're looking at $60,000 as the base salary wage, and that'll fluctuate highly depending on where and what industry you work in. And if we compare that to another industry that was in that top 10, so supermarkets and grocers, we're looking at the average wage for Woolworths store manager at 112,000. So I do not want your takeaway from this to be that you should go work at Woolies, but I do want you to be fully eyes open and walking in saying, look, I'll be honest, for me, I don't do this job for the money. I don't do this because I want to make millions. I really love the impact that I can have on people's lives and you know the many benefits of working in sport. But it's not because that there's so much money in sport. That's not the reason I do this. So strength and conditioning. I've often known enough about sport and the wider industry is what is strength and conditioning and what does that look like? So the benefits that I said before is they're fast paced, it's teamwork, it's always progressing. The drawbacks is they're the same essentially as what the wider sport brings, but just in smaller areas, and I'll go through them. Where strength and conditioning fits is in the wider picture, right? So there's sports preparation as a whole. So there's technical, there's tactical. So if you think of the techniques involved in a given sport, so if we use a team sport example like basketball, shooting, passing, screening, defending, dribbling are all going to be techniques that you use to gain an advantage and to score more points. Tactically, so how do you position your players on the court? How do you run them around screens? How do you facilitate the highest opportunities for scoring and mitigating the opposition's chance of scoring? Psychologically, so how are they connecting with this emotionally? How are they handling the stress of working in sport and training and competing and playing in front of big crowds? How are they cognitively performing? So are they able to process enough information quickly? And spiritually, do they believe in the progress of their career? Do they believe in the progress of the coach? And are they connected spiritually to the wider sporting arena? And then up the top right-hand corner is obviously surrounded by the player health and making sure their well-beings at heart is physical preparation. That's strength and conditioning in a whole, and that's where we fit in the entire picture. So as I mentioned before, strength and conditioning is just physical preparation. How do we physically prepare our athletes to ensure that they're getting the most out of their career? These are the principles, and this is how we apply any strength and conditioning training. So specificity, individuality, progressive overload, and variety, they almost work in a bit of an order. So starting with specificity, so starting with a sport in mind, is what are the sport we're preparing them for? 2 is who's the individual in front of me and how do I get them towards that sport? 3, what are the steps that I need to take then? If this is the sport and this is the individual, what are the small steps I can take all the way along? And 4, how much variety and when are we going to really push and when are we going to have to back away given finals and off season and things like that. So this is a really good graphic and Chris Beardsley is a really good one to follow if you're interested in conditioning resources. But if we go through them, specificity, so strength training or any training is very specific in the effects that it has. So you've got to be really, factors like contraction, range of motion, stability, load, speed will all affect the adaptation you're getting out of the athlete and how that's changing. So whether that's building more muscle or making them stronger or moving faster, you have to consider all of these things. And what's most relevant for the sport? What does the sport need? If it's sprinting only, you've got a high amount of force and a high amount of speed that you need to work with almost primarily. What are the muscles that are prone to breaking down? What are the joints that are going to be under impact? If it's a team sport, you've got a little bit more then to figure out is, there's lots of moves associated. If you use basketball, again, you've got cutting, jumping, sprinting, stopping, decelerating, running backwards, running sideways. So there's lots more that you have to prepare for and consider in your program. Individuality. So what's the athlete you've got in front of you? How do you test them? What's their genetics? What's their previous training history? Where have they come from? What is their anthropometrics? Are they a tall athlete? Are they a small athlete? Do they carry a lot of muscle mass? Do they have, certain injuries that they're bringing in? So these are all things you need to figure out with the athlete themselves and what's going to be best for you and how do we get the best out of your performance and what's your role within the team? Progressive overload. So the principle of just we can't get better all at once is we have to slowly increase things. We need to progressively overload them. And that's the same principle across anything that we do is, coming from primary school to high school to university to working, it's progressively overloading your capabilities from a cognitive point of view and giving you more and more ability to use your intellect and use your intelligence to solve problems. And that's the same in this example is we're trying to progressively overload their physical capabilities and trying to enhance their ability to use that in their sport. And then variety. How much variety can we have in there, and when are we going to be able to put that in? Is when are we have highly variable training? When are we going to? If you just do the same training program year round, we're not going to see any improvements. So matching in the progressive overload, so keeping progressing, and we're, at some point there's diminishing returns. That's going to start to run out. So then when do you bring in the variety to change up the program and continually find ways to improve the athlete? There might be times where you're training towards a specific goal. So you might be working in a bit more of a strength block, but that's going to have benefits down the line when you then work on a little bit more power or speed work, is you build up a really good strength foundation, and then you can layer on the speed and power later at the top. The wider the foundation, the higher the peak. So we want to be having some variety in our programs and not just doing the same thing all the time. What's the day-to-day like? So what's my job look like is testing, assessing athletes in sports. So kind of those first two principles is, what are the sports? How do we keep analyzing and looking at the sports? How do we keep, delving further and further into the sport itself? And what are the, what are there innovations in the sport that are changing the way that it's played? Is there certain things that we can work towards and really dig into the details? And that's where coaches will really have an impact. And then the athletes that are in front of us is, what are they presenting to us? Are they injured? Is there certain things that they're lacking physically? Is there, maybe they're not lacking physically and you just need to keep them in good shape, which is often the case with really high performing athletes, is there's no physical benefit to be gained, but you just need to keep them on the pitch and on the park or the court or the pool or whatever their domain is, because they're dominant. You just need to keep them there. From there, we figure out the way to go, and then we apply it. So applying interventions is putting them in place. What does it actually look like? Here's the program. Here's what we think is going to happen. Test, reassess, and if it doesn't work, re-up again and apply the next intervention. Big part of the job is coaching. So directing the athlete, building that relationship, working one-on-one with them or one in a team, learning about them as a person, facilitating their training. The coaching element is a really big part of the job. And personally, my favorite part of the job is learning about them, having an impact on them having an impact on you, and really digging into that relationship. And the way that I think about it is, when we're training, we're just unlocking more and more potential out of the athlete. Is there nothing, we're not augmenting them. We're not, they're not a cyborg. We're not putting anything on them. We're just facilitating what they've got inside them already. So to me, it's an explorative journey, and we're just trying to find out more and more and more about the athlete and what's inside of them. What are they capable of? We never know until we try. So coaching is just that journey of helping them unlock their own potential that's inside them. Collaborating and working with other support staff. So working with physios, as we have integrated programs of, coming back from injury, working with coaches to make sure the planning and programming is in place, working with other wider support staff. So, if an athlete's having a hard time with some lifestyle stuff, maybe referring them on to a psychologist or a performance lifestyle manager. If they, having some issues with food intake or some bowel issues, working with a nutritionist or some medical professionals. So that collaborative part of it, again, really, really big part of my job, and something that I really relish and enjoy is, working with some of the best in the world. And we're lucky enough at the VIS to have some of those, and collaborating with them and it's just this constant learning, and it's really exciting to figure something out new and apply it with an athlete and see what the result is. And then observing and assisting with other training. So if there's, court sessions or pool or again, whatever domain it is, but going there, augmenting that, using the principles. So in their programs, if they, there's some more variety that you can apply, or there's some progressive overload that you think can fit in there somewhere, or, you have an analysis on the sport that then maybe the coach hasn't considered yet, that's another, area that's big in our jobs. In reality, though, this is the coaching element, is, going through the hard times of your athletes. On the left, we're, doing sand dune climbs for the golfers as part of their programs, or, sitting down with an athlete and talking about their program and what's in front of them, what they've tested with, why we're doing what we're doing. So these are the two, I think these graphics or these photos really represent what it means to me is working with athletes is really being with them on that journey. It's their journey to make. But certainly we're along that with them and seeing where they go and how far they can really progress. So as managers, and if that's where you guys end up in, high performance management or in, administration or in sports management itself, is what can you do to really facilitate performance. And I think probably the main thing at the very top is removing barriers. Is try and remove all the barriers in the way of performance. So if that means facilities, if that means budgeting, if that means support staff, if that means talent pathways or having the right athletes in there, remove all those barriers and try and make sure there's nothing in the way of that performance. There's nothing stopping us from really digging in and seeing what the athlete can do. Facilitating collaboration. So quite often, the way that we call it is siloing, and something we really want to get away from is, a strength and conditioning coach, we can sometimes live in the gym, and the physio can live in the physio room, and the doctor in his office, and the nutritionist down in their offices. We can get caught in silos out by ourselves, and what we really want to do is make sure we're all on the same page and we're all delivering the same message. So facilitating that as a manager and pulling the strings at the right time and making sure the service providers, because we do get really busy and we do end up chasing our tails a little bit. So making sure that we do collaborate, we do learn, we do push each other to find more answers. And that's a really big part of what a manager can do. Having really clear systems and structures. So that can be from, something as simple as communication. How do we communicate? When do we communicate? Is it through meetings? Is it via email? Do we have certain types of meetings? Is it informal? So having those clear systems around that. And then even from an athlete perspective, it's what's our talent pathway? Who do we have in this squad? Are they scholarship funded? Are they national level? Really good, clear systems and structures, and constantly reviewing those and seeing when and where they should be updated. Is this system enough? Is there more ways we can improve that? And constantly reviewing those systems. And the system should be able to support the staff and not the other way around. Is quite what you'll see sometimes is the staff doing a really good job and they're almost holding up the system, not the system kind of releasing their shackles and letting them get stuck into their work. So having really good systems and structures around the staff so they can really dig in. Communication, and if I go back to that idea of the silo, is communicating across athletes, coaches, staff, can be with the wide world of sport and the media noise and all the things going on, is having really good communication across all parties is it's not even important. It's vital. Without communication, the whole thing dies. So making sure this is happening, and in good communication. So I mean, quality, not necessarily quantity, and facilitating the right conversations at the right time. And that's a really tricky balance. So that's a key principle of what a manager can do. And then lastly is professionally developing, it's a system, as I mentioned before, but professional development and that idea of constant progression is a principle of high performance sport, and ensuring that that's happening with your staff members and with the support staff and even the coaches, is that we're not resting our laurels. And as I said before, sport's a highly paced industry, and it's something that's moving at a constant speed all the time. So making sure we're up to date with the best in the world is a tough challenge, but certainly one that needs to be facilitated by the managers and by the staff. Guys, that's the end of my presentation. I really appreciate you coming along. What I'm going to do is just jump into my other presentation to show you to give you my contact details if you'd like. I'd love for any of you guys to get in contact with me. I'd love for any of you guys to get in contact with me if you're interested, and if you'd like to get in touch and even doing some placement or answer any questions. I'd love for anyone to get in touch. So thanks again for, if you've gotten this far and you've listened this way, well done, and I appreciate it. And I'd certainly be keen to catch up if you'd like. So once again, thanks for listening, and I'm sure I'll see you around soon.